Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is a new thing that we're trying. My name is Mike and I'm here with Vince.
Hey guys.
And we are just a bunch of racing fans from Australia who really like talking about racing. We talk about racing all the time and we're both pretty invested in it. And we thought, why not just do a bit of a podcast so we can basically take the conversations we have with each other on a regular basis and see if other people enjoy listening to them. So yeah, here we are. So this is our first episode. So our topic for today, we're going to focus on Supercars, V8 Supercars, our local series. I mean, it's called Supercars now. I still call it V8 Supercars because that's sort of our origin. And I guess that kind of segues nicely into my history with motorsport and a little very short spiel about, I guess, my background with motorsports. And that's just, I've been watching it since I was a kid. Grew up in the 90s. A lot of my sort of early motorsport memories are Australian Supercars, which was V8 Supercars at that time. And yeah, sort of growing up with the classic, Holden and Ford battle. I'm a Holden fan. I don't know if I can. Yeah, I don't know if I can call myself a Holden fan much anymore because Holden doesn't exist anymore. But, that's what I grew up with. We had Commodores when I was a kid. That was my family car, and that's sort of, I've always supported that side of it. And yeah, and from there, obviously, I got into all sorts of motorsport, from watching the main V8 series. My dad was, obviously, he was a motorsport fan and grew up in the 70s. And he was then introduced me to all the Legends, Brock and all that kind of stuff, the touring car series, the more varied stuff we had in the 80s and things like that. But all my sort of foundations was really that Holden versus Ford throughout the 90s and early 2000s. And that's kind of how I got into motorsport, and obviously F1 as well. F1's a big one. And we'll talk a bit about some of the races that happened on the weekend. But Vince, what about you?
My background goes back to probably 3 years old. Dad used to take me to what was Supercars or Super Tourers back in the day, and I'm showing my age here. But I wasn't just exposed to touring cars. I've been exposed to the super truck racing. They used to run at old, Oran Park, and Eastern Creek was a regular venue for me. Like yourself, I've taken to sim racing for a little bit, going back to V8 Challenge all those years ago. And, it got to the point where I wanted to get more involved in the sport, and I became a flaggy. Done a couple of V8 Supercar events, done some more local racing as well with flag marshalling out at Eastern Creek and the Bathurst 6 Hour as well. So
we've known each other for quite a while as well. We both went to high school together, and that's sort of some of my earliest memories and probably some of my best memories is, schoolyard discussions talking about, Scaife and Ambrose and, who was better. And, I remember very heated discussions after that very eventful Bathurst between Murph and Ambrose after that incident. If you remember that one, I'm sure you do if you're a Supercars fan of that era. But yeah, Supercars is very foundational for me. So I thought it'd be a good topic for our first thing because it's sort of one of the parts of racing history that we really share, so it's going to be something we can talk about a little bit. But let's start with just quickly talking about some of the recent races that happened over the weekend. So the big ones were this weekend we had Spa 24 hour.
Spa 24 hour, yeah. The Austrian Grand Prix.
Yep, for the Formula One.
Then we had NASCAR out at Chicago.
Yeah, obviously relevant for us here in Australia, the recent race in Chicago, because we obviously had the man, SVG, making his NASCAR debut. That is his debut. He hasn't done it.
Yes, it is. It's his first running.
And he did pretty well, Vince, didn't he?
Yeah, he won the damn thing.
That's just, is there anything he can't do at this point? How long till we throw him in an F1 car?
People are calling for that already.
I don't think, honestly, I can't see Shane Van Gisbergen doing Formula One. I don't think that's open wheels. I think he's got to have 4 doors around him and a roof.
Yeah.
It is a very different discipline of racing, doing something like, Formula Ford or any sort of formula racing and doing tin top kind of things like touring cars. And I think you give him a touring car and he's great. But I'm not sure if he'd he'd be right. He's probably too big to drive a Formula One car, to be honest.
And even his driving style, I think he's probably a tad too aggressive for the open wheelers. You know,
Yeah.
he'll be that guy coming in like every fifth lap, changing his front wing or DNFing because he's, you know, snapped his suspension off or something like that.
Yeah. That would be yeah, that'd pretty much be him. But it is really cool to see an Aussie go straight over there and win, you know. Like, I mean, probably the most in recent years, the only other sort of prominent Aussie would be Marcus Ambrose when he went over there. But he sort of had a bit of mixed success, and he had to sort of it was a bit harder. But I was reading, Shane was talking about how much easier it is actually to transition to the new NASCAR formats they have now. The new cars they have, those I can't remember what they've called them. The new revision they did, which was like last year or the year before or something like that, where they changed the cars quite significantly. Whatever the new generation, I think it is like new generation.
Yeah, it was a big
NASCAR.
aero change from memory.
Yeah, and the cars themselves have changed quite a bit, and he thinks it's a very easy transition to just sort of jump from something like a supercar into a NASCAR now, which is pretty cool. And I mean, there's been a lot of talk about him making the move. It's interesting because we'll talk about the Formula One a little bit, and it's interesting, you know, Shane and Max, both kind of similar in a way in that they're both kind of bored with the series that they're currently dominating, with you know, Shane sort of talking about perhaps making a move over to somewhere else. But I mean, I wonder how much of that is serious and how much of that is, hey, Triple Eight, how much more money have you got to give me to keep me here in racing in supercars?
See, I don't see it that way. I see that he's genuinely bored with V8 supercars. If you take into account the amount of complaining he's done about Gen 3, he's not a big fan of Gen 3. Even though he's having success on the track, he just doesn't like the car. And, you know, even during the development of Gen 3, he got to test it out before the other teams have. And he hasn't liked it. He's been a big voice in opposing some of the changes that were proposed. Some have gone through, some have not. And even just watching the racing as a spectator, keep in mind that I haven't gone to a track for a little while. Watching it on TV, I don't know. There's no excitement. It's you know, race starts, the Red Bull just runs off, does its thing, you know, every now and then.
Wait, hold on. Which one are we talking about here? Supercars or Formula One?
Probably a bit of both.
It's kind of the same story. It's very similar, isn't it?
But supercars this year, the only fairly interesting thing is that Erebus is doing really well.
Yeah. Well, we'll get back to supercars, I think, a little bit later, I guess. So good for NASCAR. Spa 24, I can't say much about Spa 24. I didn't watch it a lot. I sort of do what I usually do with the Spa 24. I'm not a big fan of Spa, to be honest. I just sort of, you know, caught an odd moment or two, and the racing looked pretty standard affair for the 24-hour. It's one of those races you really have to invest almost your whole time into to keep track of everything that's happening. And I love endurance racing, and it's one of my favorite things to analyze and participate in sim racing. But you know, unless you're really committed to it, it can be hard to follow the whole proceedings of the events because it's quite processional. I mean, GT3 is a fairly processional series. It's almost similar to Formula One in that way. Very high downforce, very easier to overtake than Formula One, but still quite tricky, you know, especially with the BOP and how they balance the cars together and all that kind of thing. But quite a good mix of manufacturers. And obviously the other big Australian news from Spa 24 is Chaz, you know, doing well, winning class Pro-Am.
Yeah, won the Pro-Am class. It was a very eventful weekend for them with their lead driver and team owner actually crashing the car and ending up in hospital. But, you know, as they say, fuel runs through the veins of a racer, and the team owner was able to acquire a car in hospital to run this weekend.
Well, that's the good thing about that's always a thing that everyone sort of says about. It's one of the advantages of GT3, you know, being a kind of customer car program. You know, it's pretty easy to just hook up a new car if you've got the funds there. You know, it's they're all kind of built to spec, so it's pretty easy to just sort of organize yourself a new car even at short notice. So it's sort of one advantage of the GT3 series. But yeah, the Spa 24, there was some interesting stuff happening. I think we should probably mention, obviously, it's a pretty tragic weekend for motorsport to have the passing of a driver on track. It's never a good thing. I never like to see it. It's unfortunate that that's the second time at Spa in recent years.
Yes.
We've had a Formula driver as well. I mean, there's a lot you could say, about Spa specifically as a track, but I think, look, I have my issues with Rouge Raidillon, but this crash didn't really happen at Rouge, and it was more really to do with weather rather than the track itself. I think I can't. Yeah, I guess my criticism would be it's like when you're talking about Formula cars like that, like if you're talking about GT3 cars driving in those conditions, perfectly fine. They've got windscreen wipers, they've got doors around them, they've got
an actual windshield.
There's enough protection there that if you do have a big smash, you're pretty likely to survive. And even modern Formula cars, very safe now in terms of crash damage, but drivers just not being able to see.
No.
I know that the car had a spin, in the wet and was across the track, and another driver has, because of the spray and because of the poor visibility, was just unable to see and has hit him at a quite considerable speed.
Yes.
Unfortunately, a driver has lost their life. And look, sometimes safety stuff does ruin the fun a bit and can take good tracks away from us. And I'm not necessarily looking at taking away Spa here, but I think it's a bit of a wake-up call that we really need to look at, particularly with Formula racing, when we make the call that we can't race here. We cannot race in these conditions. It's too dangerous. Cars are quick, visibility's poor.
I've seen Formula One races put on hold for less than that. And dare I say, shame on the officials and shame on the organisers. If we have had the best in the world not go out in conditions that have been less worse than what was there, I think the onus falls on them, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I mean, you feel for them because, there is that commercial side. They do have to make money, but the safety of the drivers has to be top priority, you know, and you got to be able to lose money every now and then. And look, Spa is a track where it's going to rain a lot.
Yeah. Dare I say it comes down to a cultural thing too. Like, I was at Bathurst where the race was delayed by 3 hours because there was that big off with Lowndes and I can't remember who else. And they had to ensure that the wall was right. They had to repair the tyre bundle. They had to clear all that sort of stuff. And the spectators around me were like, okay, yeah, makes sense. We have to wait.
I mean, there's not much more we can really say about it. I'm sure there'll be more details and there'll be more talk about that in the future. But I think it's just, our condolences to obviously everybody related to friends, family, everybody.
Oh, absolutely.
It's tragic when, I love this sport the danger is part of it, and every racing driver knows there's that chance even in this modern era. But, you never like to see someone lose their life in any sort of situation. And, especially at 18 years of age too. Yeah, someone so young.
Yeah.
It's sad to see that sort of thing. And I think definitely there needs to be some more consideration for the track conditions and what is acceptable and what we're going to allow, especially when it comes to open wheel, not tin tops, basically. But let's move on to that too. I want to say something more positive, but maybe something a little bit more mundane, which, the Formula One weekend, Austria, it's a good track. I like Austria.
Yeah.
I think it usually produces reasonably good racing, and we did have some good racing. The sprint race was actually quite good this weekend at Austria. I thought it was good, and some of that was owed to, a lot of that was the mixed conditions, being a bit wet. We're just talking about cancelling things because of rain, but obviously it wasn't that wet. Yeah. It was definitely not at a point where it wasn't safe for them to drive. That's the kind of wet conditions you kind of want to spice up the racing. And it did make for an interesting race. We saw a lot of overtakes. We saw a lot of good battles, especially in the midfield, but even up higher up the order. And I think it really showed one of the biggest things. I mean, we commented when we were watching the race. It was really interesting. It stayed interesting throughout the whole thing, but it was really interesting before they activated DRS.
Yeah. It showcases the driver, right? As much as having a good car is important, we want to see the drivers work a bit.
Yeah.
You know, instead of pushing a button that drops a flap and, I get, 14 Ks an hour quicker.
Or if you're Red Bull, like 1,000.
Off to the moon.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually getting the driver to race, and see them working the wheel, because at the moment a lot of those cars feel like as if, or look like as if they're driving on rails.
Yeah, it's the sort of slot cars thing, right?
Yeah.
Where they're just sort of following each other around. Yeah, look, I think DRS was brought in because they wanted more overtaking on track.
Yeah.
And I think initially it did serve its purpose reasonably well, but it's been around for a few years now, quite a number of years now. It's almost a decade we've had DRS.
I think so, yeah.
It's been quite some time. And I think we've gotten to the point, I mean, it's hard to say because obviously the conditions were wet and that equalizes the cars a lot as well. So, but it felt like the racing was a lot more equal and you had cars sort of showing their performance and showing individual, like you were saying, with the individual driver's skill, but also just the difference between the cars in terms of pace and outright speed. And people were still making overtakes. People were still making moves. And the moves were interesting. They were doing it in interesting locations. It wasn't just... And as soon as they activated DRS, it's just...
Killed it.
The passing is happening. It's like, yeah, we're getting overtakes now, but they're all really... Like, a DRS overtake is not an interesting overtake. I would rather see less overtaking and have it be in the corners and... Or even just more battling on track with less overtaking, just cars following each other really close, looking for opportunities, trying to psych the other driver out, instead of just, all I have to do is make sure I'm within that, second, half a second, so that I can get to a DRS zone, line them up, and just breeze past them on the straight. It's not going to change the state of play too much. The Red Bull's still going to be smashing everyone even without DRS. The car is just so fast compared to everybody else at the moment, especially when Max is driving it. But I think that we should trial no DRS in a normal conditions race, in a dry conditions race. And I mean, we have the sprint races now, right? And it's such a good, I'm kind of, some people hate sprint races. I don't mind them, it's probably not the best allocation of resources. I understand the team's not liking it. I don't think the point structure is very good, What it does allow is for us to experiment with things like, let's have a sprint race where nobody gets to use their DRS, and even if it's dry, and just to see what kind of racing that produces. Even if it is just sprint races don't have DRS or something. I'd like to just see what impact it has, and I'd like to trial it because the cars can follow a bit closer now. I mean, not as close as they could last year because the teams have figured out ways to add more downforce, and that's not a surprise. Teams will always do that. That's how you make cars fast and reliable, is you add more downforce to them. The only one not doing that is Williams, and I don't think that's a conscious choice. They just, they've got no drag because they've got no downforce. But yeah, that's my takeaway from the sprint. And I thought that probably the most interesting part of the weekend was that sprint race. The main race itself, pretty processional. There was some cool stuff. It wasn't the worst. Austria generally produces good racing because it is a pretty fast circuit. The biggest talking point, obviously, is track limits and the penalties there. I don't know. What are your opinions on track limits?
Well, when you're having 48 penalties dished out in qualifying, says something, right? I know the drivers push and keep on pushing. And what we said earlier today, if you move that white line, they're just going to go over it anyway.
Yeah.
But then the number of penalties, I don't know the number of penalties handed out during the race, but it was a considerable amount. And as the commentators were saying, it's a shame to see the race results determined by penalties.
Yeah, it always kind of sucks. Look, I mean, track limits are there for a reason, and there's only a certain amount of things that track designers and organizers can do to make track limits more obvious, right? Like, so the old argument is, it's like, well, stop, just add grass, add sand, to stop drivers going that far. But the thing people have to remember is that Austria is not just a circuit where Formula One cars go to race. It's also a motorcycle circuit.
Yep.
It's the same as tracks like, Misano, where the track limits can be a problem. I mean, Formula One doesn't go to Misano, but GT3 cars go there and they have track limits problems there as well, and track limits can be quite strict. Because it's both of those circuits are pretty prominent motorcycle circuits, and motorcycles can't have lots of sand and grass all on the edges of the circuit. That's not going to be conducive to their racing. And MotoGP is a very big motorsport. It's not a motorsport I've ever followed particularly. I've never been into motorcycle racing that much. It's cool, it's fun, but it's not something I've ever followed particularly well. But it is a valid form of motorsport, and lots of people like it. So we can't just ditch, MotoGP just because we want to see better Formula One races. Sorry. So yeah, track limits is always going to be hard. And it's that whole thing of, the drivers will say, it's like, well, the line should be extended, or, that corner should be opened up a bit because, we can go faster through there. It's like, but as you were just saying, you move that line, they will push that line.
Yeah.
It's always going to be a thing. It's like, sure, I think track organizers need to look at it and see what can we do to make the track limits more obvious for the Formula One cars. What can we do to ensure that? All right, so let's move on, I think, to our main topic. So we want to talk about supercars and sort of the state of supercars and where we think it's at. And I want to start off with positives.
Okay.
Because I think we're in danger because of our history with the sport, and because we've seen it for so long. There's always going to be a bit of that nostalgia stuff in there, right? We're always going to remember the glory days of when we were kids and watching it.
The big bangers going around.
Yeah, there's always going to be a bit of that. The sport's changed, the world's changed, the culture's changed, the country's changed. So I want to start with the positives. And I think the positives of what I've seen from we got the new Gen 3 cars, right?
Yep.
And the new cars and the racing so far, I think has been pretty good. And I think the racing itself is classic supercars. It's tight, it's close. The field's very close together. Let's not get into the parity thing. We'll get into that later. Parity is an issue, but look, it's a brand new formula. It's a brand new format.
Yeah.
There's some bugs to work out. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt there. But the racing itself, I think, has been pretty good. It's still kind of classic supercars. There's argy-bargy going on. The racing's close. We're still talking about low downforce cars. There's overtaking. Yeah, I think the racing is still good.
Yeah.
And the racing quality hasn't dropped significantly. But when I try to look for other positives, I'm struggling with the series at the moment. And I've definitely found myself, I was kind of hoping the new Gen 3 stuff would kind of reinvigorate my passion for the series, but it hasn't. And I think that's where a lot of supercars fans are at the moment, where they're not as interested as they used to be. And it's hard to sort of pinpoint exactly why. I think a lot of people will put it down to, obviously, the lack of the rivalry, right? The Holden Ford thing is gone, but it's kind of been gone for a while, pretty much since the Mustang came in.
Yeah.
That Holden Ford rivalry is gone because, the Mustang came in and then we still had a Commodore, but it wasn't really a Commodore.
It's the Commodore we shall not speak of.
It's the not actually a Commodore, right? Like that was not a Commodore. No Holden fan was supporting that car because it was an Opel. I mean, it's always been an Opel that but it wasn't Australian, that car. And pretty much since that point, it's that Holden Ford rivalry has been been hard to kind of follow. And it's worse now that obviously Holden's completely gone out of the sport. And now we've got GM, and like as a Holden fan, it's hard for me to I can't really follow Ford because I've spent the last 20 years bashing them, right?
That's
because
right,
as a Holden fan, yeah.
I'll get to you one day.
Can't really support Ford, right? But it's hard to follow GM because GM are partly responsible for why we don't have Holden anymore. So it's sort of hard to support the manufacturer that kind of killed the people I used to support. So even though, Holden's always been GM, but yeah, it's hard in that way. But I think, you read a lot online, you read you read Reddit or anywhere, you get the complaint, that it's like, it doesn't feel Australian anymore. There's no local connection to the series because it's American cars now. It's Mustangs and Camaros, which, they're not even, especially the approachableness of the cars as well. Like a Mustang and a Camaro are not a Commodore and a Falcon.
Oh, no.
It's not a family car, like it used to be. And that was kind of part of the appeal, and we've lost a bit of that. So that aspect of it I get, but it's also like, I can't blame Supercars for that. You know what I mean? Like the series, the racing series, because that's just that's a bigger issue. That's Australia, and our inability to viably produce these cars. And those cars that we used to love, those Commodores and Falcons, they're not as relevant to the market anymore. No. People don't really drive sedans. People drive SUVs, and they drive
hot hatches and
hatches. But even more than hot hatches, like it's mostly people driving four-wheel drives. You know, people. You have a Ranger. That's your car of choice.
To be honest with you, if the Falcon was around, I probably would have bought a Falcon. Brand new.
Yeah.
But that option wasn't available to me, unfortunately, and I went from a Holden Cruise.
Oh, we won't talk about the Cruise. We'll be here all day talking about that rubbish car that I can't believe you ever bought.
Surprised it made it to Bathurst.
That's the worst car I've ever driven, and I've driven some bad cars. I've driven some rubbish cars, but that Cruise was something else. Anyway, go on.
Yeah. But as you were saying, the old adage of win on Sunday, sell on Monday is long gone. You have a racing series, and I know you said you wanted to start on a positive note, and yes, the racing has produced some good drivers, some good, scenarios and all that sort of stuff. But I can't help but feel negative towards this series. You have a series that it's invested money into developing this Gen 3, which is a year or two late, to be honest with you. All right, it was supposed to launch much earlier than what it did.
COVID is part of the problem with that.
COVID was part of the problem, but then you also have V8 Supercars committing to the Camaro, which GM has stopped producing or is about to stop producing. So you're going to find they're going to find themselves in a situation much like they did with the ZB when that particular car's rights were sold to Peugeot and GM did not have availability to that design anymore, or access to that design anymore, sorry. And now you're having the Camaro coming to a stop. So what are GM going to use?
Well, yeah, I think it's that whole thing of like, they want to be able to use a market-relevant car. But I don't think Camaro was ever a good choice. But I don't think the Mustang was a good choice either in terms of market-relevant cars. Because neither of those cars are... they're sports cars. They're not... Like, if you're trying to recapture that Commodore versus Falcon battle, we won't call it Ford versus Holden, we call it Commodore versus Falcon, because that's what it was, pretty much after the 90s, once it went to a dual, a dual rivalry format, and we cut out all the Group A cars and all that kind of thing. It was very much Commodores and Falcons. Commodores and Falcons are not cars that people buy anymore, even if they could. There's a reason that the Commodore and the Falcon died, and it's not, it's because the market just didn't want it. Most people just don't want that car anymore. I don't understand it. Personally, I prefer to have sedans everywhere than SUVs and four-wheel drives are dominating our roads. You know, I would prefer that. You know, I'd rather just, you know, go back to when it was, you know, you had a hatchback if you wanted something small and economical. You know, you got an Astra or a Focus or a Fiesta or a Civic or, you know, something like that. Yeah. And if you wanted something bigger, you wanted to cart the family around, you got a Falcon, you know.
You got a wagon.
Yeah, you get a station wagon. I mean, you know, I'm a big wagon man. I love my wagons, you know. I mean, I drive a Nissan now, you know. I don't drive a Holden anymore. But until the Nissan, I drove Holdens pretty much exclusively, you know, and that's the kind of car I like. But I'm not the market. You know, you're not the market. No. Neither of us are. Most motorsport fans aren't the market for cars these days. Most people, even towards the end of the you know, Falcon and Commodore era, most fans weren't driving Commodores and Falcons anymore. They were driving, you know, an SUV, or they were driving around in a four-wheel drive. That was what was dominating the market, and that market relevance is something that they're just not going to capture again. And no. I don't think you can create a series anymore that does what supercars did in the 90s, because people just don't drive cars that are race cars. No. The average person doesn't.
To be honest with you, with the fall of the sedan and what I see is the gradual decline of V8 supercars at the moment, you're having TCR pop up. You're having a lot of younger kids buying these hatches. You have the amount of these damn Mercedes AMG A-classes that I see around driving up and down my street, cracking their exhaust because it's cool, you know. Like, I'm seeing more and more of it. So maybe, you know, like you said, that market shift is going to make TCR more relevant.
Yeah.
You know, and the racing in TCR is actually pretty good. Oddly enough, you're having a lot of V8 supercar drivers part-time in it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, like, you know, TCR is, it's an interesting little series that you sort of keep a side eye on. Because it is. I think it is more relevant to the market. These little hot hatches, you know, Hyundais and Civics and all these little small cars,
the Renaults and
like these are the kind of cars that people who want something a little sportier do tend to buy these days. You know, because even though, you know, something like like a Fiesta ST or something like that is, although they don't sell that anymore, do they?
No, that's gone.
That's gone now.
The Fiesta as a whole.
Yeah, the Fiesta's gone now. But, like, you know, cars like the Hyundai i30s and those sort of things, that, you know, if you want something a little sporty with a little bit of punch, you know, but you don't want to be paying V8 car prices, you know, or even V6, you know, fuel prices, because, I mean, let's not get into fuel prices either. That's the kind of car a lot of these people are going to buy, you know. I see car enthusiasts now, young car enthusiasts, because, you know, we're in our mid-30s, you know.
Getting old.
Yeah, we're not that bad yet. We're not over the hill. We're not over the hill yet. But yeah, like I see sort of younger drivers now and what cars they're enthusiastic about, and it's a lot of those sort of, you know, they're like, oh, they want the new, you know, GR Yaris or the new Corolla or you know, that's the sporty fast car that people want to drive, because it's fast and fun. You can take it around the curves and all that kind of stuff, and it's, you know, maybe not as practical as a sedan, but cars these days are so big that even a hatchback you can transport a lot more stuff than you could. Like, it's not like it was in the 90s where
it's not the be all end all.
Well,
sort of XL.
Yeah, like a Hyundai XL or like something like, you know, like a Civic or whatever, which were a hatch, you know, those little hatches, they were small cars back then, you know, they're not small anymore. You look at a Civic now, it's massive. It's like half the size of a Commodore.
Put two RAV4s next to each other.
Yeah.
Like, and then like the original RAV4 and what's out now, it's like almost 2.5 times bigger.
Yeah. Cars these days are so big. And look, that's just the world, and that's, you know, safety and all those things that's influenced that and made it so that, you know, cars have to be bigger, unfortunately. Like, you look at a Mini now, it's not
so many.
So the market relevance thing as an argument for why supercars is less interesting is absolutely valid, I think, and it's why some people have turned off. But I don't know if the series can maintain what it's maintained for so many years and the format it's maintained, the idea of big, hard to drive V8 touring cars, that whole thing is not going to be relevant to a market anymore. You're just not going to have that, and you look at other racing series that, people might compare it to, like GT3, for instance, right? And GT3 racing they're not accessible cars that they're driving in GT3.
No, but the market they're attracting to go and see those races are very different people as well.
And that's what I want to get into, because I think it's harder than it ever has been for racing to appeal to a broad audience like it used to, because there's a few factors that have changed things as far as supercars go. So obviously, you're no longer, the car you're driving on the your daily driver is no longer also the car that we're driving around the circuits. There's no longer those Commodores and Falcons out there. And a lot of the fans of supercars, compared to, say, fans of Formula One, even in the 90s and 2000s, was, without sort of pocketing people into brackets, was sort of low to middle income earners, right? Average people, if you want to put it that way, I mean, not that people who had money didn't also like supercars, and not that you had to be poor, or not that it's a bogan sport.
No,
Sometimes
not at all. Like,
people always say, it's all bogan sports and stuff. But I don't think that was it. I think it was more just that it was, racing for the average person was what supercars used to represent. And I don't think it can anymore, because just the way the market's gone, as we've discussed. So I think that's what people have found a disconnect with, is that they used to enjoy the series because there was that connection there. But that connection is gone. And if that was all that was connecting you to the series, then you're not going to have that anymore. What I think was, for me, is that the best era of supercars was that 2006 kind of period, right?
Yeah.
Basically from the VET Commodore all the way up to the VE almost.
or that's end of ELAU to be a FG for us Ford folk.
Yeah. You're always going to have fond memories of when, your particular thing was winning. But like even when the dominating car was the BA Falcon, right?
Yeah.
Like, I actually think that was some of the best racing, even though Holden wasn't winning all the time anymore. Like we dominated with the VT and the VX, and then, Project Blueprint came in and sort of evened the field a bit. And I think kind of got it right. It did equalize the field. Suddenly the Falcon was able to be competitive again. And it was no longer just the Commodore dominating. And that was good for the sport, I think. But other than the racing being really good, but what was also really good about the series at that point was, I think, the personalities that we had in the sport at that time. You had, whether you loved or hated particular drivers, there was so much around those drivers that was interesting to watch. You wanted to know what they were doing off track. You wanted to see how they were going about their, kind of daily lives and stuff. And you like the off-track rivalries and the banter and all that kind of thing. Like we talked about Ambrose and Murphy, but you also had, you also had Scaife. You also had Ingle. You had, the Kelly brothers, and you had all these interesting...
Larko. And
you had all these interesting drivers, and they were very... some drivers, like Murph's a good example of someone who was a bit...
15 minutes.
A bit rough, he was a bit rough around the edges, and he was, someone who, he spoke his mind.
Yeah.
Right? And Russell Ingle was, it was basically, if you're a Commodore fan, you had Murph, and if you're a Ford fan, you had Ingle. And that was
the old man shaking the fist.
Yeah, that's it. Well, I mean, he's the old man shaking the fist now. He wasn't the old man shaking the fist. I mean, he was pretty old by the end there, wasn't he? By the time he actually won. He'd been at it for a while. But yeah, even if you're like, someone like Mark Scaife, very contentious. A lot of people aren't big fans of Scaife. I think Scaife, he's got a bit of that Lewis Hamilton thing where he's a bit of a victim of his own success. I think he's often not credited for being as good a driver as he actually was. Honestly, I think Scaife was a very good, capable driver. And I don't just say that as a Holden fan. I think that comes all the way back to when he was driving the Nissans and, he was able to transition from driving, an absolutely dominant car like the R32 to driving the Commodores and stuff where the team wasn't as competitive but was still able to get really good results and pushed his way up to the point where he was just smashing championships and having records and stuff. Like, I think regardless of what you think about the guy and personally, and yeah, he's very opinionated and he does sort of speak his mind, and he's got a very particular way of seeing the world, and that comes through in nowadays in his commentary and all that kind of thing. But I would rather have someone like Scaife, who's a bit divisive and has his opinions and is a personality, than I think what we get now, with the exception of a couple of drivers like Shane Van Gisbergen and that, there's not as much of that sort of personality and rivalry between the drivers. You don't get that banter. I mean, we used to have, I remember, one of my favorite things to watch was they did that on Channel 10. They did
the panel.
V8 Superstars. That was a great show, right?
I know the incident you're going to bring up.
No, I mean, not for any specific. There were so many cool things in that show, and it was the drivers they were just having a go with each other, and it was like kind of discussions you'd have, around a table with your mates, your Ford and your Holden fans. You know what I mean? Like that. It was, they just felt like regular people, and I think racing drivers now in supercars feel just that little bit less approachable. And I don't think that's necessarily the driver's fault. I think there's some great personalities in there, and you see it sometimes. Yeah. But
Courtney's a good example of that.
Yeah, right? But I feel like there's just too much...
Media training?
A little bit too much of that media training, a little bit too much of that professionalism in the sport now.
But it's more like a driver being able to call out another driver, right? We're not talking to the extent when NASCAR where they end up throwing punches in pit lane.
Yeah.
But, for example, if driver A ruined driver's B's race and driver B just marches down to the driver A's pits and just mouths off, maybe we want to see a bit more of that. Like, it's like you're saying, it's very tamed. It's very tamed. They're careful what they say. They have a media person standing behind them, and we see that in F1 as well, recording everything that they say, just in case the media takes it out of context. They go, no, that's the recording. But I want to point out something that you brought up a little bit earlier, and that's the clientele that goes to watch these races, right? I'm going to open a can of worms, and I'm going to mention two words: pay TV. As a subscriber of pay TV, I feel that the broadcast quality is better than what you get on free to air.
Yeah.
Okay. But then you're excluding a lot of people. Okay. Dare I say it's the same with ticket prices.
Yep.
I wanted to go to Eastern Creek when they ran the night race this year, or when they're going to run the night. Sorry. I wanted to go to Eastern Creek this year because I haven't been to a night round at all for V8s. But then when I saw the ticket pricing and, from memory, this was a while ago, it was $130 for the Friday sprint and the Saturday race.
Yeah. I mean, I think the on-track ticket pricing, to be fair, isn't too bad.
Yeah.
It's not as cheap as it used to be, but I think it's still reasonably...
Not if you have a family.
It's reasonable. Yeah, look, yeah, if you got a family, it's harder to take your family to the races. Absolutely, yeah. Like, I remember as a high school kid, we could afford to put enough money together and go.
And we were working like what? Some of us were working like entry retail, right?
Yeah.
And that's something we looked forward to.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like
it was
like yourself, photography for me is more of a hobby-based sort of thing. I like taking photos of cars, but having to pay $130 for 2 days of racing in this current climate,
with how things are at the moment, yeah, definitely, it is something that can be hard to justify yourself. I think I look at it in perspective, right? You pay probably the same amount to go see a concert.
Yeah,
you know what I mean. and that's one night. You pay a lot more to go to the Australian Grand Prix, a lot more.
Yeah.
You know, something like Formula One is extraordinarily expensive. So when I look at it in that perspective, I don't. Well, yeah, it is more expensive, and it's definitely going to be pushing people away. I don't personally see the on-track ticket pricing being as big an issue as what you initially brought up, which is the pay TV thing. I think that's been more damaging to supercars than an increase in ticket prices, because it used to be that it was all free to air and you could just watch the races for free on Channel 10 or Channel 7 or whatever channel it was on. 9 back in the day. It was a thing that, it was part of that thing that I was talking about before, which is the approachability of the series. And when they went to pay TV, and it was the worst timing, because I think when they brought in the other manufacturers, when they said, let's open it up, and they brought in, and it was Nissan and Mercedes and Volvo who all came in, right? Volvo were like a little bit later, but it was Nissan and Mercedes first, I think, who came in. I think that was a pretty good move, because it at least sort of made it, a little bit more relevant, because it's like, some people were, maybe people who weren't Holden and Ford Commodore fans, but they had a Nissan Altima, or, even someone, had a Mercedes or, a Volvo, right? Like it helped bring a little bit more relevance to it. But at the same time they did that, they also cut all the free-to-air TV rights. And suddenly, instead of having, these great... Because the racing was still good at that point as well when they brought in those other manufacturers. I remember, that was like 2013. I actually remember we went to Eastern Creek.
Yeah, for the testing.
For the test day, yeah. And I took photos, and I saw photos of that event, and that was the first time we saw the Nissans and all that. And there was a bit of buzz around it, because it was like, hey, this is making it interesting, to have more manufacturers and a little bit more variation in there to spice it up a bit, and make it a bit safer in case, Holden or Ford go off, which was looking likely even at that time, that they weren't going to be able to maintain it, especially Holden. We're in trouble by that point. So that part of it was a bit killed by them going to pay TV at the same time, because it meant that in order to watch this new format, in order to watch this new variation on the series, this sort of bringing it back to being a bit less Ford and Holden focused and being a little bit more open to other manufacturers, less people were watching it, on the daily, because you couldn't just be scrolling through channels on your TV and it would come up, and you watch a race. I stopped watching the racing pretty much as soon as they went paid TV, because for me, the only sport I'm really into is motorsport. I'm not into, football and soccer and whatever. I'm, mostly just into motorsport. And for me, to get paid TV just to get, at the time, Supercars and F1, and it's still pretty much what I would watch on pay TV, right? Like those are the only two sports I would watch. With the format of pay TV here in Australia and how it worked, wasn't worth the extreme expense, that it still is. It's very expensive to get it. Even now we've gone more digital and it's changed as well. Like, free to air now, if they were to go make it free to air now, that would be irrelevant, because free to air has just died in most households anyway. Most people aren't watching free to air anymore. They were going to make it free to watch. They put it on YouTube or something like they do with GT3. Like it's amazing that, something like the Spa 24 hour is on YouTube for free. You can watch the full broadcast, That's just crazy to me, that you can, and Nürburgring 24, you can watch the whole race on YouTube for free, The lack of that sort of availability for supercars to be able to watch it in a, and I understand why they did it, business, money. And Murdoch's, got the coin to do that. But it was at the same time they were doing a lot of experimentation with the series, going to, other countries at that time, because they went to China, they went to...
Dubai? Abu Dhabi.
Yeah, they did a race there. They did a race in America. It was at the same time they were experimenting with all that sort of stuff, but it was harder for everyone to watch. So you couldn't experience it, and it's like, oh, we're getting low ratings. It's like, well, how much of that is because the average person, your general market, which was, generally people who maybe didn't, because motorsport fans are not necessarily sports fans.
No.
And that's a big thing, and sports fans aren't necessarily motorsports fans, like there's not as that big of a crossover between them, that it could be people like me who it's like, well, it's not really worth it. I'll just, I used to watch Formula One in less than legal ways because that was all you could do, right? Because it wasn't on free to air anymore, and like you want to support the sport and you want to pay for it, but it's like it's just if I could do a subscription where it's just like, hey, I just want to watch these 2 series and it costs less, I would do that.
With Formula One you can.
With Formula One
you need to do it dodgy.
Yeah, but that's right. It's like it's not an easy thing to do, and Supercars doesn't have that either. No. Like you get KO, that's it. But you can't just be like, I want KO, but I only want Supercars, and I don't want all the other things. You got to get KO with every other sport on there, and they're like, oh, what is it, like $50 a month or more?
Got no idea.
Yeah, because you got Foxtel, don't you?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's quite expensive, and it's like, I get the Formula One and Supercars out of it, and that would be worthwhile, but it's still just a lot of money, and how do you bring new people into the sport? I remember watching Supercars on a weekend with my dad.
Yeah.
We would just watch it, because it was on TV.
Same thing in my household too.
Yeah. And, we had Foxtel at home when I was a kid, but, when I moved out and I'm living on my own, it was just, I couldn't justify it, spending that much. So, and I think the pay TV thing, at the end of the day, I think it was a bad call because I think they probably lost more by making it less available. Maybe they could have done it later once they'd sort of reinvigorated people, and maybe that would have made the people like Nissan and Mercedes and that stay with the sport because they might have seen more people are watching it. Maybe not Mercedes. I don't know how Mercedes ever really fit into Supercars. I think they were...
That was a weird customer deal.
Yeah, I think they were just targeting to it. But I think Volvo and Nissan for sure could have been...
Yeah.
That could have resulted in... Because, and Nissan in particular, Nissan were quite successful. They won quite a few races.
Yeah.
With that Ultima. And it might have sold Ultimas, It might have had more success with that particular car, and Nissan might have been like, oh, well, because they did eventually kill the Ultima. But they might have, kept it going in Australia for a little bit because it's like, oh, well, it's in Supercars and people like it in Supercars and people keep buying it. And that might have reinvigorated some things. But look, I think that whole part, as we went through, is, being market relevant. I think we've covered that in terms of that's just not a goal that Supercars is going to realistically hit without completely changing. And something like TCR is the series that's market relevant now. Like, internationally, Supercars is very fondly regarded. Like, Americans love it. And it's quite popular with racing fans because of the things that make Supercars, which is still there. And that's what I started with, and that's the positive that I want to keep maintaining here. Supercars is still a very unique racing formula that nobody else really does. It's high-powered, rear-wheel drive cars.
No TC.
No traction control, no ABS. Still using, you still have to use a clutch on the downshift. Very low downforce. So, you don't have the problems Formula One has where they're, it's a bit processional. GT3, same GT3. I like GT3, but it is it's like Formula One. It's very processional. There's not tons of overtaking. It's a lot of cars just following each other around and looking for weaknesses and pit strategies and all that kind of thing. Like that's the part about GT3 that I find interesting. It's the strategy side of it, the pit strategies and all that kind of thing, especially in the endurance races and all that. When they swap drivers, how that's what makes GT3 interesting rather than sort of the on-track action in particular. Whereas Supercars is much more about the on-track action because those cars can overtake each other. They can run into each other.
Bump and run.
Yeah, like a GT3 car is very sensitive aerodynamically. So when, you sort of rub doors with a GT3 car, you can absolutely spin them out because, they're not able to take that like a touring car can. And a Supercars is a classic kind of touring car format. And they're very difficult to drive. And like every driver who comes over here and drives one, they're like, wow, these things are great. You know, they're really fun to drive. They're really engaging to drive. And so that formula, you know, the closest thing that anyone comes to that is NASCAR. You know, that's the closest other racing category to that.
I think there was a technical partnership between NASCAR and the development of Gen 3 as well, if memory serves me right.
Well, that's what Shane was talking about, and how the cars are reasonably similar now, and it was easy for him to sort of just jump in and adapt. And I mean, the guy won, you know. It's clearly it's not a big learning curve, right? But yeah, like those things about supercars are unique, and they are something that's we kind of want to keep that, but you know, what about supercars is going to draw people in? You know, and I think what we need to go back to sort of my point about what I liked about it when I was growing up is that there needs to be more narrative in the sport, because look at what that's done for Formula One, right? The Netflix thing, the Drive to Survive thing, you know, has brought in so much general audience to the sport. And people don't like Drive to Survive. I don't. I know. There's a lot of opinions about Drive to Survive. I think as a marketing ploy, it's genius. Yeah. Right? You know, I mean, working marketing, I did a lot of that. It's genius, right? It is exactly what they needed to do to get the regular punter, people who weren't even interested in motor racing. You know, we have a friend, Ben, who's not really ever been into motorsport his entire life. You know, he's been around us a lot and we talk about it a lot, so he's, you know, had that in there, but he's never really been a motor racing fan.
And he went to a GP.
Yeah, he went to the Melbourne Formula One Grand Prix this year, you know, and it's because of Drive to Survive. And he's not even ashamed of that, and I don't think he should be.
But see, personally, I have a problem, and my brother coined this phrase, and I think it puts it perfectly. Drive to Survive is the Kardashianization of Formula One.
Sure. Like I don't want to get into a whole discussion about whether or not we like Drive to Survive or whether or not we think it's good, right? That's a whole thing. But I think, and I don't necessarily think supercars should do an exact copy of that or anything like that. But I think that's the sort of approach supercars needs to take. They need to create, whether it's with something like a Netflix show or, you know, maybe doing even something similar to what Porsche did with, you know, with Fassbender and that whole series, you know, the Road to Le Mans thing, you know, some sort of little bit of marketing that can go a bit global and bring attention to the sport from outside of Australia. Something like that could work because there just needs to be a story. You know, there isn't a story around supercars. There's racing, it happens, there's some fun on track, and then we go to the next track and it's just a repeat. Every race, there's not like an underlying, you know, there's some controversy every now and again. We're talking about parody and stuff, but that's all nerd stuff, right? Yeah. Like that's all just stuff that's interesting to me and you, motor racing fans, you know? Yeah. Like, and look, I don't want to lose people like us. I don't want to lose motor racing fans. But if you look, like, just because Formula One has Drive to Survive and it brought in a whole bunch of, you know, casual fans, it hasn't changed the racing fundamentally.
No, it hasn't. But the big, like, this is the issue I have, right? We're having these people, and as you coined, casual observers, right? And this might be ironic with me bringing this up, starting things like podcasts and opinion pieces and stuff like that, mouthing off information that they have no idea what they're talking about. Yeah. You know, calling for penalties that don't exist or getting facts wrong, and they're disseminating this to a public, to other people that may not know. Sure,
but I'm just going to give you an old marketing adage here, which is that any news is good news, right? Yeah. And having what you want, regardless of the quality of the talk, what you want is people talking about it. Yeah. And that's what they need to do. They need to get people talking about supercars internationally, locally. They need to make it something that, you know, like I remember I was astonished in 2021 after Abu Dhabi, after that whole...
No, Mikey, no.
Yeah, after that whole thing, right? it was amazing to me because for some reason, because I barely watch free to air, but for some reason I was watching just regular news and they were talking about Formula One.
Yeah.
They never talk about Formula One on the news. Never.
No.
But that tiny little bit, and that wasn't even Drive to Survive doing that.
No,
that was just because
the controversy carrying it.
Yeah. They pushed it and it was a narrative and it was a story around Formula One. And that was a thing in the sport that happened, you know, and they still don't, like, you watch the news today, they're still not going to be talking about Formula One race in the weekend. Maybe an odd mention that, oh yeah, Max Verstappen won a race and, you know, like that'll be it. That'll be all they cover on it. Even in the sports section, motorsports never been a big thing. But everyone was talking about that. Everybody was talking about it because it was controversial and there was something interesting to talk about, right? And Supercars needs things like that to happen. They need to be on the news. They need to be, you know, on the Twitter feeds. They need to be out there in the world. And I want 1,000 uninformed people doing hot takes on what's happening in Supercars at the moment. I want that because the more of that goes around, the more interest there is in the series. The more people are going to be like, oh, this Supercars thing, that sounds really interesting. Maybe I'll watch some of that, you know. And I think we just need some of that. We just need some media attention on it. We need to, you know, let the drivers be a bit more open with each other. You know, let them slag each other off. Let them, you know, have a bit more biff and barge.
Just NASCAR it up a little bit, right?
Yeah, and maybe create, you know, I think something like a documentary series would be really good for Supercars right now to bring people into the sport because the idea, the product is good. I mean, at the moment, parity is an issue. Yeah. They'll figure that out. But the product itself is good. The racing is good. The racing is unique.
Yeah.
And yeah, the cars aren't that relevant. Yeah, the Camara's wasn't a good car to hedge our bets on, but you know, they'll work that out. They'll put some other car in. Maybe it becomes a Mustang's spec series. Even if it becomes just one manufacturer, and it's just Mustangs driving around. They can still make that work, you know, because there's plenty of series that are just spec series like that, like Porsche
BMW
Cup
series.
Yeah, BMW C2 series and things like that. Like, I'd like to get to know the guys behind the wheel because the drivers, that's what Drive to Survive did. It showed that's like the drivers and the team managers, you know, and you know what they're talking about. Like Gunther Steiner
has his own merch line now.
Yeah, he became a meme, right? Because he's just an interesting, fun personality.
Yeah.
We've got, like, Dick Johnson is running a race team and he's a great personality and he's got a lot of cool things to say, but they don't talk to him because he's pretty opinionated. You know, and he says things that you know, might be
a bit old school.
A bit old school, yeah.
And, we'll just put it that way.
Yeah, and look, again, like, I don't want us to go, you know, I don't want it to become that whole thing of, you know, we need to have, you know, we need to allow things like casual racism and all that kind of crap in there. Like, no, it should still be a globally accepting sport, you know, and it should still be, you know, appealing to a broad audience, and we shouldn't be aiming to be offensive for offensive sake, you know. But create characters, create narratives, create stories around it, each race, you know, because those stories are there. We just got to get someone in there documenting
to pull them out,
you know, just like they did with Formula One. And I think if anything's going to, I don't see another way to make supercars bigger and more relevant. I don't think it's the cars. I don't think it's the racing, ignoring parity. I don't think it's the cars and the racing at the moment. I don't think that's what's made it. And I don't even think it's necessarily the lack of market relevance, because how relevant is Formula One to any sort of car stuff? It's not. It's not relevant at all.
It's just a name slapped onto it.
It's just names slapped onto it.
Yeah.
Like, you support a team. You don't really support, you know, I mean, yeah, you know, people, how many people buy a Honda and then support Red Bull because they use Honda engines? Like, not many. You know, how many people are driving Renaults and supporting Renault? Like, that's, or Alpine as they want to be now. But like, that's not what brings people to the sport. What brings people to the sport is the content, the racing, obviously, the people, the stories, and the narratives. And that's what I really think is the key for supercars and what it's lacked. More than any of this, the cars aren't the same, or the, you know, the it's no longer Holden versus Ford and all that sort of stuff. Those things are gone. They're not coming back.
No.
And that's not where they should be aiming it. And they should be just trying to bring people to the product, because I think the product's good enough that people will watch it if they just make it so it's like they want to cheer for Shane Van Gisbergen,
I'm going to use this to bring up our last argument, our last point on this. And funny you mentioned Shane. Are drivers getting bored with the series? Is that why we're seeing Shane going to NASCAR for one weekend and then doing an endurance race a few months after, and seeing Chaz at Spa, seeing Cameron Waters, even though Cameron Waters has been doing sprint cars for a while, is that something to worry about? Shane has actively said he's starting to get a bit bored. He's looking around for other options, and this weekend's display in NASCAR is evident of that. So and even Scott McLaughlin, he won, I think it was 2 championships and then left rather quickly too. Is it a case that drivers are getting bored, and is that a problem with the product? If the drivers are getting bored racing this particular product, what does that say for the spectator?
Part of that is because it's kind of the peak of what you can do here in Australia. Supercars, that's it. There's not much further up you can go here locally, and New Zealand as well. So we should be mentioning New Zealand. It is sort of the limit, and there's no much further to go. But it's also like, what's their motivation for sticking around? I don't think the racing is the problem, like that they're bored with the racing, because I think that's just going to be individual drivers. Like, look at Max. Max Verstappen is he seems to be getting pretty bored with Formula One, and because he's just winning so easily, and it's just no longer a big challenge for him and stuff. And I can understand that. And I wish him luck. Go do endurance racing or something, Max. Go do something else. Go have fun with your life. You've got enough money and you've got enough talent. You can do whatever you want. And that's not me wanting to get him out of the series and make it more interesting or anything like that. That is just legitimately, Max, you do your thing. You don't need to win 8 world championships to prove anything.
Start your own team.
Yeah, start your own team. Go live your best life. Go be a sim racer for the rest of your life. Right? Whatever. But that's not Max necessarily getting bored with Formula One because Formula One's garbage. That's Max just moving on. But for someone like Shane Van Gisbergen, I think it's a similar sort of thing, and I don't think there's much that would keep him here because he's kind of just done it all. He's won every race and stuff. But if we make the series itself more of a premiere sort of thing, more of a worldwide sensational thing where people in America know your name, people in Europe know who you are because you're a supercars driver, people are going to stick around for that, that notoriety, that you give it a sense of prestige. It's not just Aussies who like watching you or know who you are. It's everybody, you're at the same level as, you're almost at the same level of a Formula One driver. That'll keep people around. That'll motivate kids kids will want
to go karting, and
kids will want to be in touring cars because it's popular, because they see these personalities. It's like, I want to be like that guy.
Yeah.
But if they want to be, seen as a world class driver, they have to kind of go to Formula One because like supercars isn't it. Supercars doesn't have that level of prestige worldwide, and they need to build the brand so that it does. And that doesn't mean going to other countries. I think a lot of people think that means that they have to go international and they have to go to European circuits to make it relevant to those audiences and stuff like that so they can see it. And I think they probably would need to do like 1 or 2 races overseas, maybe, But yeah, like there is going to be those things. And it's like, I'm not saying it's a perfect solution or anything, but I think it's part of it and we need to move towards that. And I think if you're seeing drivers not wanting to continue participation in this series, part of that is going to be that notoriety of it, that desire to, go beyond the international stage at Le Mans or Spa or, go do Formula One or go do NASCAR, go do something which has got a big international name to it, because even NASCAR has got, NASCAR itself, while the racing is much more interesting than people give it credit for, I think. A lot of the reason NASCAR is interesting is those personalities, is those guys on track, you know, is those little stories and narratives and stuff like that. But even they could do with more of this. I think NASCAR could do with more of the same, more of that sort of Drive to Survive segment. And I don't, I'm sure I'll get flack for that, you know, to say that Drive to Survive is a good thing for motorsport. But I think it genuinely is. I think we need to get the average person interested. You know, we need to bring someone who's, you know, because you can't do it with cars anymore. Because cars just aren't the same thing. You know, cars are, for most people now, more than they ever have been, just A to B things.
Yeah, just a tool.
They're just a tool that gets them where they're going. Yeah. You know, less and less people are driving cars. Less and less kids are getting their license now. You know, we just need to bring that regular person in. We need to make the sport relatable. We can't do that with the machinery anymore. That's just a done thing. Yeah. It's done. So let's do it with the people. Let's do it with, you know, making the sport accessible. Put it on YouTube. Make it free to watch. You know, maybe don't do every race for free, but maybe, you know, try and make it so that people can access it, can watch it. People overseas can watch it live. You know, I don't even know if you can watch Supercars live.
I think there is a website.
Overseas.
There is a website because our friend that lives in the States used to use it.
Yeah, but is that a legitimate website?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, like, but how accessible is that? How many people know about that kind of thing, you know, overseas? And, you know, because you talk to, I mean, look, yeah, to bring it home kind of thing, like I look at sim racing, right? And in sim racing, supercars, everyone loves it. Right, everyone loves driving those cars.
It's not easy
because they're hard to drive. Like they're hard to drive, but they're fun, and the racing's interesting. And like sim racers are big fans of supercars, but those are generally motorsport enthusiasts, people who are sim racers. And like it's got that popularity overseas, and they would probably love to see more races, and they would love to see more content around it, and more relevant and up to date content around it. And I think it's there, you know, and I think there doesn't need to be that much change in the cars and in how things go. I think we just need to focus on bringing an audience that's not necessarily already interested in motorsports, but maybe they like competition, you know, maybe they like other aspects of it. They want narratives and stories. Mm-hmm. I think that's the thing it needs to do. I don't see anything else they can do with the cars because once you do that, it doesn't matter what cars people are driving. You know,
I think my 2 cents is that I don't know. I'm probably coming across as the really negative person in this podcast. You know, yes, I am nostalgic for the days of old. However, I see in its current state that Supercars is dying a slow death. That's how I see it.
I would agree.
You know, as I brought up before, the Camaro is on the verge of not existing anymore. The money that they've put into developing the chassis to fit the Camaro is gone once they stop it. The fan base, I think, is the old fan base. I'll put it this way: is potentially being discriminated against. Right? There's no free to wear, as we mentioned before. Ticket prices have gone up a considerable amount. The price of a ticket to Eastern Creek for the night race that's coming up later this month is $130 for 2 nights, compared to a 3-day pass at Bathurst for $150. You know, you're having, like, I remember being 12 and getting the esky with Dad and walking through the gate and stuff. But these days, your whole car gets searched. You know, fair enough, there's like licensing laws and all that stuff, but your car gets searched for alcohol. You know, I remember a story when I was marshalling where this guy, you know, the sleeves that the chairs come in?
Yeah.
Didn't bring a chair, but he shoved it full of beer cans and made it look like a chair and walked in and got found out. But, you know, it's yeah, I understand the need for that. But I just feel like even though they portray this family-friendly thing. Go and meet the drivers, get a photo with them. It needs to also be family accessible.
Yeah. I mean,
without having the families come into the race, the kids go, oh, fast cars, loud, bang, awesome, and they can't watch it at home. You're harming your future fan base.
I definitely don't disagree. Making it more accessible is obviously a key, whether that's with, cheaper track tickets or with making it more available to watch for free online or something like that. I think the ticket pricing thing is less of an issue if you make it easier to watch on, screens. I think it's, if you can watch it at home, without having to have a big paid subscription, I think that's a big thing. I think that's more important because I think you can maintain those track prices and people will still go if you give the sport that international appeal, if you give it that broader narrative, and if you make it so that if you can't afford to go to a track, you can at least watch it on TV. It's like music. Like music tickets, concert tickets are expensive. They always kind of have been.
Yeah.
And going and seeing a band is a lot of how they're making their money, right?
All the Swifties that listen to this would know.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Going and seeing a big show and a big concert is a lot of where the money comes from for the big players at the moment. And with motorsport, it can be the same sort of thing. It's like you get most of your money from, the guys going to the track. But you don't alienate people as long as you make it so that, you can go, you can listen to music. You can listen to Taylor Swift on Spotify or whatever music service, Apple Music or Google Music. It's not Google Music anymore, YouTube Music.
Unfortunately.
You can listen to it for free with ads, or you can listen to it for a pretty reasonable subscription fee for most music services, right? Like $10 a month or something in Australia, which is like very cheap. You can listen to all the music you want, and that's all music for every genre kind of thing. It's really broad. It's still accessible to the regular fan. They can still hear their favorite artist's music. They're not cut out or restricted from that. But like, as you say, if you want to go watch motorsport at the moment in Australia, you either go to the track, which is expensive, as you say, or you get pay TV, which is also expensive. So how are you going to bring those kids and those casual fans in, if they can't afford to even see what Supercars is like, by going to a track or whatever. So I agree that we do need to make it accessible to the regular person. But I think that's sort of it's almost like a step two. And the step one needs to be, we need to make it interesting for a general audience
to bring the crowd in.
You need to bring that crowd in first. You need to make it so that it's relevant again in some way. And I think, you just do that that's honestly it. I think you just need to create those stories and you need to create that narrative.
Thanks for listening. This is Vince and Mike signing off. And just don't forget, without volunteers, racing doesn't happen. So make sure, if you're interested to getting closer to the action, speak to your local racing clubs or reach out to your local track, or if you're in Australia, Motorsports Australia, and ask about how you can volunteer. Being as close to the action, waving flags is actually not that bad. All right, so that's us signing off.
Yeah, thanks everybody for listening. We don't have a regular schedule for this point. We want to kind of do it as regularly as we can, but it's just kind of a thing that we're trialing at this point in time. So we will continue to record episodes and see what the response is like. But any feedback is always appreciated.
Absolutely.
But please remember, if you're on YouTube, like, share, subscribe, or if you're on any of the other platforms, be sure to give us a follow. And we'll hopefully bring you another episode soon. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll catch you next time.